Hello, and thank you for joining me with this presentation today. Today, I'm going to talk about geothermal potential and utilization in Wyoming. This was a final presentation, an abbreviated final presentation that we gave to the Wyoming Energy Authority associated with a financial assessment and resource assessment that we did for them. So let me get into this. First in agenda, we'll talk about the purpose of this study that we did, how we went about doing the geothermal resource assessment, the utilization technologies that we decided were going to be best suited for this region, and then what specific technologies would work in what specific regions. I'll get more into that later. Then the financial modeling, what actually works in an economic sense, and then finally some conclusions and recommendations. So, what was the purpose of this study? We did this study for the Wyoming Energy Authority, and we assessed the feasibility for geothermal opportunities characterized by geothermal utilization technology and its effectiveness in certain Wyoming regions. The steps included the resource characterization, defining which utilization technologies would work for which resource type, looked at new technologies, then we did the financial modeling, an environmental risk assessment, and then also a regulatory outline. Now, the environmental risk assessment and regulatory outline, those I'm not really going to get into. I'm going to stick to these for the purpose of this presentation, kind of cut it off at the financial modeling. First, as any good resource assessment, we should start with the geologic review. So, looking at the Wyoming geology and asking the question, how does geology play a role in geothermal energy, both production, but also kind of location? Where is this resource? We want to answer the questions, why does this matter for geothermal exploration? Well, first, Wyoming has a long history of structural evolution. We'll see more of why that matters in a bit. The faults and folds create pathways for thermal resource migration. So we have these deep seated faults that could be pathways for this migration of hot fluids to the surface. And then we also have multiple different sedimentary basins. Those different sedimentary basins could host different types of resources and different locations of resources. Finally, thinking about the thermal resource, what type of thermal resource is there? Many of us know Yellowstone being in the northwest portion of Wyoming, but Yellowstone itself is just one spot throughout the whole state. And yes, that Yellowstone has volcanic activity, but how much and where? And does it extend throughout? And then also, we need to look at the radiogenic decay of isotopes. Now, I'm just going to give a little plug here. Last year, I really dug into the whole idea of what geothermal is and what makes a geothermal resource. Since you are here listening to this, you do have access to that talk last year. I would suggest going back and listening if you are starting completely new. So now let's talk about actually doing the geothermal resource characterization, what we focused on in this study because of time constraints and really the timeline for the project. We really only focused on doing a literature review, well data analysis, and looking at the existing body of work. For Wyoming, most of the work was completed anywhere between the 80s up to 2011. I think this is a very important point that I want to make. A lot of the baseline fundamental resource characterizations are getting outdated. So for Wyoming, the last one was completed in 2011. That's 10 years of new data, drilling, new technologies, new data collection techniques that could be utilized to better understand the resource. I'll get off my soapbox and keep going. So there have been 12 major publications. There are 14,000 oil and gas wells or thereabouts, all of those having bottom hole temperatures that we can utilize for understanding the the underlying resource and the thermal regime. Of those 14,000, there have been 380 wells that were logged for temperature. There's also thermal conductivity measurements that have been taken. And using these data here, the temperature logs and the thermal conductivity, we can calculate geothermal gradient and heat flow. So these are things that were done in the past that we have gone in and collated all here. One of the major studies was a examination of all the thermal springs within Wyoming. You can see that they kind of are all over. The thermal springs just kind of show up and they don't necessarily have one distinct pattern. These are localized surface expressions of heat coming to the surface. These are all lower temperature. And now let me take a step back. I want to point out this is obviously not talking about Yellowstone. Yellowstone is a super volcano. Now, for this study, we did not analyze or include Yellowstone at all. Why didn't we? Because Yellowstone itself is a national icon. It's a national park. It is one of those things that we probably never will go in and extract energy resources from, and for good reason, because it is this beautiful national monument, not technically a national monument. And it's something that we need to probably just for now assume that it is going to be off limits both now, near future, and probably far into the future. So we don't include Yellowstone. But the rest of the area of Wyoming has hot springs, most of them in the lower temperature range from 60 to 113 Fahrenheit. Continuing with that literature review, the most recent work that was done in terms of new data analysis was by Ryan Dingwall and others in 2011. This is a heat flow map that Dingwall et al. Made looking at the state of Wyoming. He actually went down further into Colorado and I think over into Montana. But looking at it, there's a few things to point out. Most of the basin areas are low to intermediate temperatures and lower to intermediate heat flows. There are major aquifers in these basins that have greater than 120 degrees Fahrenheit water, but 120 degrees Fahrenheit is not necessarily hot enough for power production, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then the heat flows that they calculated are anywhere from 33 to 80. Now, to give context to that, the majority of the state is in the continental average value, that being anything that's kind of in the green range or around 50 milliwatts per meter squared. That's continental average. So there's no obvious thermal anomaly in those locations. You do see Yellowstone and you see kind of tails down into Thermopolis and over in the Cheyenne region. And actually you get the Denver and Julesburg basins are quite hot in terms of their thermal regime. There was also additional work collating data and doing some analysis done by the Wyoming State Geologic Survey. They compiled data from the USGS, the SMU and AASG databases, which is the National Geothermal Data System, and also data from NREL. They produced high geothermal gradient polygons, which is this map on the upper right. Those are areas of interest for future geothermal exploration. This is a great start, putting together all of the data into one spot that now enables future exploration. It is still kind of that first phase though of just collecting data and now having it ready for future wildcatters and future explorationists going out there to produce energy. So our recommendation to the Wyoming Energy Authority at this time was to go out there, continue this data collation, update those heat flow maps and the temperature depth grids, and calculate the thermal resource. Now, those are things that we did not include in this study, but are things that we're interested in doing in the future. Now, one step that we did beyond looking at the data that the Wyoming State Geologic Survey compiled was looking at all of the data. Now, I've got that map kind of stretched out here to be a direct overlap, and I want you to look at this for a second. Burn this map into your mind. There's data points. These data points are wells. You would think that all of these wells are all of the wells for Wyoming. Now I'm going to click forward and just watch that map. Now here is the map of all of the data in the National Geothermal Data System. I'll go back and forth. Notice that there are quite a few wells that are not in this Wyoming map that are in the database. Now, a lot of those could be data that were removed because they were anomalously low or anomalously high. But in here, we just don't know. And it's something that we should be looking at and analyzing because there are all of these data. We can use those to have better maps and better understanding of the resource. So this is the National Geothermal Data System database. These are temperature and depth data. Most of these are bottom hole temperatures. So what we did with these is we looked at the regional thermal resource just by looking at those temperatures. And then we separated these wells into two categories, either wells for repurposing, those being having a bottom hole temperature greater than 200 Fahrenheit, and then those being opportunistic for direct use of heat, those having temperatures below 200 Fahrenheit. Now, one addition here, the wells that have temperatures above 200 Fahrenheit could also be used for direct use heating, and actually they could also generate cooling, but that's something to really, I'll discuss that a little bit later as well. So now looking at this well data, what we did as our first passes to this is making a depth to 125 degrees Celsius, that being about 200 Fahrenheit, 250 degrees Fahrenheit. The idea there is that 125 C is about the minimum temperature for generating electricity. So how deep do these wells need to be in order to hit the temperatures we need for power generation? This is really targeted more at what if we want to drill new wells? The basins all range in depth to that 125 C. That's because we're just using the data and analyzing it. That variability matters because if we're looking at something like Gillette, Wyoming, potentially that is a little bit shallower, and Gillette may have an opportunity, whereas Casper is on the very edge of this basin, and Casper is going to be quite deep. You have to drill in order to hit that minimum temperature. So this gives you that first rough guess of where should we be going for geothermal power generation. And then one thing to point out is Cheyenne and the Denver Basin. This looks like a great option. There are wells in there that suggest drilling as shallow as 3,400 feet to hit 250 degrees Fahrenheit. That may be an artifact though. So I added this question down here. Is this an artifact of a few hot wells? So are those potentially uh, erroneous data that need to be removed? These are questions that we would dig into if we get to that point of somebody saying, okay, let's go look into the Denver Basin in that Cheyenne region and decide which wells are we going to repurpose or where are we going to drill new wells. So that would be almost a next step. Now the next page as I move on is the geothermal resource characterization and the temperature at 6.5 kilometers. Now this depth, this is the drilling limit that we said. There are a few wells that actually drill to this 6.5 kilometer depth. Now, 6.5 kilometers is 21,325 feet. That is very deep for a geothermal well, very deep for an oil and gas well. But the point of this map is to say, what is the current drilling limit? Meaning, how deep are we currently drilling? And what are the temperatures at that depth? Here, looking at basically anything that's above 300 Fahrenheit, meaning this beige color, those are areas that have high enthalpy power potential. So those have geothermal power potential if we want to drill to 6.5 kilometers. So these are areas that have that that technical potential for power. Now, looking at this from a large scale, there is a lack of regionally elevated geothermal regime at drilling depths, which makes you wonder and question, are there is there this big, large scale anomalous thermal regime? Is there a large geothermal resource in the state of Wyoming? You do again see Yellowstone, and this is kind of what we would expect if we saw pockets of geothermal energy potential. We would see spots like that showing up. You do start to see that down here again in the DJ Basin. So, what does that mean as we look at Wyoming? When we look at Wyoming, the thermal regime that's showing up is kind of a consistent continental thermal regime, and then the tectonics that that have that have the tectonic history of Wyoming has created several localized low temperature geothermal resources. These are structurally driven, meaning as you had the laramide orogeny and the severe orogeny, as you create these anticlines and synclines, eventually you get this deep seated fault. Those deep seated faults allow for fluid to flow up to the surface and create these hot springs or these thermal manifestations, but it's not something that has this elevated remnant heat that is driving it. It is simply deep seated fluid flow going down to some depth and then flowing back up, just kind of collecting the heat that's naturally in the deeper parts of the subsurface. What would this be good for? Well, from this large picture view, we think this is best suited for small scale direct use applications. So that was the next step, thinking about what are the technologies that could utilize this resource. Now, here I'm going to go fairly quickly. We went through each of these various ideas. What I am going to focus on, so let me take a step back. This picture on the box on the left highlights that region, the temperature range for Wyoming's resources, anywhere from ambient air temperature all the way up to about 250 to 300 to 275 Fahrenheit. In that range, we could have anything from geothermal heat pumps to greenhouses to building heating and cooling and domestic hot water to potentially industrial heat use, and then finally organic Rankine cycle driven power production. This would be well repurposing. So I'm going to focus mostly on this organic Rankine cycle, give you a brief refresher on what that is, and then we'll talk about what could be used where. What is the organic Rankine cycle? As we look at it, the organic Rankine cycle uses some type of working fluid to generate power. So walking through this, you have a well, it's producing heat. This could be a geothermal well, or this could be an oil and gas well that produces heat. It runs through a heat exchanger, heating up a working fluid that then flashes to a vapor, and that vapor is under pressure. That goes, it spins a turbine. That turbine spinning generates electricity, sends that electricity out on the grid. And now the spent fluid, the spent working fluid, goes back through a condenser, condenses back down, and starts the process all over. The benefits here that you could utilize this for low temperature fluids. It's also suitable to integrate with other energy and technologies, i.e., repurposing wells or using flare gas. And this also doesn't require a large power plant. There are 100 kilowatt size systems, and I'll show these on the next slide, that you could physically bring in on the back of a semi trailer. The challenge is here that because of the low temperature, they have a low thermal efficiency, which means low cost efficiency, which means they generate less power per amount of energy going through the system. And there are critical technical requirements for both the fluid flow rate and the temperature difference, which makes this difficult as we're talking about lower temperatures. We're decreasing the ability there. And one big question here to highlight is that modular well repurposing has not yet been scaled. We're still trying to figure that out as an industry. How do we take 100 kilowatts at one well? How do we create that on the megawatt scale? Here are two examples of these small modular organic Rankine cycles. The one on the left is the several different electrotherm units, anywhere from 75 kilowatts to 150 kilowatts. And these ones are in Japan in a high temperature setting. The example on the right is the Rocky Mountain Oilfield Testing Center. That's Teapot Dome in Wyoming. And this was a 250 kilowatt organic Rankine cycle. There are several of these that are still generating power, and these are kind of worldwide. There are several existing companies that are working on just this, developing these modular units and trying to increase the efficiency and decrease the cost. So I do think that there is a lot of opportunity here and a lot of potential. So that is what the organic Rankine cycle is. The heat utilization, I think, is a little bit more straightforward. You use the heat. So I'm not going to get into that too much until now when I talk about it. So now we're talking about utilization technologies with every different region. Looking big picture, we're going to go basin by basin and talk about what potential there is. As a refresher, I've included this Lindell diagram on the left and highlighting Wyoming's resources again. So we're really going to have two things that we look at: the low temperature direct use utilization, and then the high temperature, what we're calling high temperature, which is the power generation. So first, looking at the low temperature, these are all the wells that are less than 200 degrees Fahrenheit, which would be appropriate for direct use applications. We have them the wells color coded by temperature. White is 100 to 125 Fahrenheit. Blue is 125 to 150. Green is 150 to 175. And yellow is 175 to 200. I think the important part to highlight here is that every single basin has wells and a high number of wells that are in this temperature range, meaning something that could be used for direct heating. Now, it's important here to point out that when you're utilizing the direct heat, you also have to, so you have the supply of the heat. Now you need the demand, which means you need that end user close, nearby. And that is another step that we need to look at. And that's what we do here. So this was work that was first compiled by the National Renewable Energy Lab. This is from 2016, so it's a little outdated, but in general, everything is similar. This is the heat demand and the end users looking at the whole state of Wyoming. In these, the lighter beige colors are lower heat demand. The higher, darker, almost into the oranges and reds are higher heat demand. Looking at commercial, residential, and manufacturing. So, as expected, the commercial and residential, commercial like commercial buildings, are located at population centers, Casper and Cheyenne. That's where you get a lot of the heat demand for commercial and residential. Interestingly enough, for the manufacturing, you still have a lot of heat demand in Cheyenne, and then you also get a lot of heat demand in the Rock Springs, Green River area. So we have this opportunity here near Rock Springs and then also near Cheyenne. So that, all that being said, all of these basins have population centers, at least one. So things like Riverton, Casper, Gillette, Cheyenne, Rock Springs, Green River, all of them have at least one population center. And when we looked at it, they also have at least 5 things that are categorized as manufacturing. That could be somebody who needs heat. Now, switching over to the electricity potential, looking at high temperature wells greater than 200 Fahrenheit for electricity. Here we've got 2 different maps. We've got a temperature map on the right, the wells color coded by their bottom hole temperature, and then a map on the left, wells color coded by their well status, meaning are they still open? If you look at this map, large scale, there are fewer wells that are available for electricity potential repurposing, but there are still some wells in every single one of these major basins. The Bighorn and the Denver Cheyenne Basin or the DJ Basin, those are the smallest number of wells. But I do think that as we go further down into Colorado, we will have more opportunities in that DJ Basin area. And it's important to point out in the generalized Southwest Wyoming, there are a lot of wells that are high enough temperature, kind of on that cusp of 200 up to 300 Fahrenheit, but are also open. Those are the wells that are of particular interest because of the hot temperature at the bottom and the still open status of those wells. So overall, there are wells kind of throughout the state for both electricity production and direct use heating. One more map in here, potential for new geothermal wells. This is that same target of 125 degrees Celsius or 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Looking at this, we can start to get rough ideas of how deep we're going to need to drill to hit that temperature. On average, I would say a rough guess is 10 to 12,000 feet in general. Cheyenne In the Cheyenne region, we're going to be a little bit less. Everywhere else, we're probably going to be right around that 10 to 12,000 feet, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. So if I were to be asked, where are you going to drill a new well? I would immediately start looking into the Cheyenne region of the Denver Basin. Now, one thing we haven't talked about is future geothermal utilization technologies. I think it's important to point out, let me go back. It's important to point out that all of these wells that are in existence were originally drilled in those locations focused on oil and gas production. When we're talking about efficiencies and the opportunity for geothermal energy or decarbonization, we also need to focus on the ideas behind that efficiency. And one of those is full utilization of low carbon renewable energies, but also from our perspective, placing proximity of resource to the end user. One of these things that we think about in that context is a synthetic geothermal reservoir. So the big problem is affordable, reliable, resilient power, grid, and heat decarbonization, and trying to do that with things like photovoltaics and wind, and then pairing that with costly limited duration battery storage. So if we use a synthetic geothermal reservoir, we can have a constant green energy supply through ultra long-term energy storage in the subsurface. Now, this would have worldwide applications throughout multiple large-scale industries. And this next slide here, I'll just explain one quick picture on how that could work for something like Wyoming. Wyoming, they don't have the best geothermal resource, but they do have one of the best wind resources in the US. So they have one of the best wind resources, and these little shaded blocks here are those same basins. A good majority of Wyoming is also covered in sedimentary basins. In sedimentary basins, what we would be looking for to create a synthetic geothermal reservoir is a saline aquifer, something with 100 millidarcies, porosity in the 10 to 25% range. And again, saline, so that we're not competing with fresh use water resources. Here you have abundant wind near Casper, also near Cheyenne and Laramie. And you also have all of these transmission lines, meaning even if you don't want to put your SGR right next to Laramie, you could put it somewhere where you still have easy access to transmission lines. So that is just one almost side note of what opportunities also exist and ways that we should be thinking about full scale, deep decarbonization. So now let's get into the financial analysis. And here, looking at those different technical resources, now what is the opportunity? What is the financial ability to make those resources, work? There are a few assumptions that we made here. We made the assumptions that the reservoir can sustain a high capacity factor, meaning geothermal systems run about 95% capacity factor. They're on 95% of the time. We're assuming that these can also do that and do that for 30 plus years. Now we're selling that power, and we assumed 3 static price points, either 70, 90, or 110 megawatt hours. Or if we're selling this as heat, we are replacing either a $3, $5, or $8 per MMBTU cost. We assumed taxes, tax credits, and makers inputs, but we don't have a carbon tax or a carbon tax credit. Now, this is important to point out. The work completed here was before the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Inflation Reduction Act kind of changes the landscape for a lot of this. And for most of these kind of projects, it makes it more attractive. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this and as you're trying to understand the numbers here. And then we calculated different financial metrics, internal rate of return, net present value for a 7 and a 10% discount rate, break even year, and then average annual return on investment. Now, I know that these are going to be available later, so I'm going to go through this rather quickly, but I think it's important to point out and discuss a few key metrics here. Here we're looking at the well conversion for direct use, meaning directly using that heat. The net present value for these is around $1 million, but it does range anywhere from negative up to +3. And your IRR around 19 to 20%, but could vary from 10, maybe up to 40. So here, if there's an end user and a sufficient resource to fully utilize all of that heat, then repurposing for heat looks like it has pretty good commercial potential. Now, well conversion for power generation, you'll notice that these values are a little bit less. Your IRR is somewhere around 12% and potentially as low as 10, maybe as high as 20%. Your net present value is probably around 0. Now, the value ranges from negative up to maybe positive $500,000. And so what's this saying? If you have the need for power or you want to repurpose your wells, then doing this could be an okay investment. You will probably be able to make money. It's not a home run. It's not going to knock it out of the park, but this is an opportunity to decarbonize, to generate electricity, and to have a long-term kind of investment strategy. And I also want to point out break even years here. We're talking about a 15-year break even. Let me go back real quick. With the direct use, we're looking at a break even year of about 8 years. Now, looking at new wells being drilled, break even year is on the order of 25 years. Probable value is negative. And then your IRR is about 7%. Here, the key point here is that drilling conventional geothermal wells it's expensive to go in and drill new wells for a resource like this in this kind of market. So right now, drilling new wells is probably not a good option unless there's advances in new drilling techniques, which are being done at places like the Frontier Observatory for Research in Geothermal Energy, or FORGE. There are great breakthroughs occurring in drilling technologies, and this could be an opportunity, say, in the next 5 to 10 years. But right now, I would say it is risky. Now, the last financial analysis to give a rundown on is the synthetic geothermal reservoir. And this is why I included that snippet of what it is and why. Here you're looking at a similar payback or a similar IRR of about 7%, varying from 0 to 20. Your net present value, though, is higher, potentially around 20 million. Value ranges do vary. They could be negative up to very positive. Your break-even year is still about the same, about 25 years. And then your average ROI is about 7%. Now, this is still a new technology. It's still in the demonstration phase or pre-demonstration. So existing SGR designs are high cost, but it's important here. One, this doesn't incorporate the value to the grid. It doesn't incorporate new designs. And it also doesn't incorporate the IRA. But through all of this, this is a way to really scale not only the wind power in Wyoming, but also the large scale generation potential. Whew. Well, let's wrap this up. We've been talking a lot. Let's get into the conclusions and recommendations that we made to the Energy Authority. Giving them this information now, what should they do with it? So, the Wyoming geothermal resource, there are localized areas of low to moderate temperature heat, that being about 100 to 250 Fahrenheit. There is no widespread high temperature geothermal reservoir. So there's not really a big, large area to start looking for utility scale power generation. There are different utilization technologies that can be used. Right now, we would suggest the resource type is best utilized for direct use technologies, but there is potential to repurpose wells with an organic Rankine cycle unit if there's high enough water production. And then something that I didn't talk about at all, but I want to highlight in these conclusions is that geothermal heat pumps are applicable everywhere. There are there are new designs and strategies to make geothermal heat pumps even more useful on a thermal energy network or large district heating and cooling scale. But currently the market and the growth is slow because it's kind of focused on single end users, house by house basis, not large scale district heating and cooling. We can talk about that more later during the Q&A session if you want. Now, SGR feasibility, there's a lot of co-location of aquifers, high wind resources, which suggests there are specific areas that have higher probability of success for an SGR deployment, and Wyoming is one of those areas. But this is one of those that we're starting to think not just about geothermal, but the larger energy ecosystem. How do we utilize everything together all at once? So the next step here would be a demonstration project. With the financial modeling, each utilization technology has variable commercial viability, and that really depends on those assumptions made and how accurate those assumptions are. Again, to highlight, these financial models do not include the new tax credits that are part of the Inflation Reduction Act. And and the most promising opportunity that we see for Wyoming present day is wellbore repurposing for direct use heating. And that's a situation where if you're going to do direct use heating, you've got the supply, now you need that end user. So that would be the next step, is combining the heat and the understanding of the heat now with the end user. Where do those two come together? So our recommendations to the Wyoming Energy Authority were high temperature utilization and associated technologies are not suggested, but keep up to date with the advances and really the advances in how to produce that power and drilling technologies. The updated thermal regime evaluation and calculations that we suggested need to be done. Those will ultimately refine resource characterization and understanding of where those resources potentially are. Well, repurposing is a potential option, and it is a potential option today. But further evaluation is needed now to co-locate those high opportunity wells with the potential end users. Detailed analysis on the total resource is needed for individual geothermal deployment projects. The geothermal heat pumps are applicable everywhere, but they don't scale well today. There are new ideas, one of those being something like a Gabe's system, and those are starting with a public building as an opportunity to do this technology demonstration and to have faster growth at a large scale. And finally, detailed study of the potential of a wind-charged synthetic geothermal reservoir in the Cheyenne region would be a great way to unlock another renewable energy resource with the existing understanding of the subsurface. So I just want to include this in there. Right now, I've really just talked about one geothermal study, kind of looking at how we could help the state of Wyoming. Now, if you have a prospect and don't know where to start, we can help you. To give you a quick rundown on PetroLearn, we were founded in 2014, and we then were focused on geomechanics, technical training, and consulting. And that shifted to more research and development and technology development in about 2018, trying to fill technical gaps that we saw in the subsurface energy industry. Now we continue that specialized consulting now in geothermal, carbon sequestration, and oil and gas. We offer full scale, full cycle, fully integrated geothermal resource exploration and evaluation. The way I like to put it is from greenfield exploration to green electrons on the grid. We have multiple technologies that we've developed bringing these ideas to market, one being ConvertDeck, which is a well screening tool for efficient identification of the highest value resource options for end of life well bores. We have a drilling dynamics geomechanics tool. This is a full wellbore geomechanics model, which gets extracted from drilling data alone and can be used for wellbore stability, stimulation design, future drilling hazard prediction, and we're working on developing other utilization opportunities with this. We also have Marked. This is a monitoring and characterization of microseismic to watch fluid movement and fracture evolution in and around the reservoir zone. This was originally developed for geothermal, but we see applications in CCS and in the traditional oil and gas space as well. Then we have Carbon Watch. This is a fast processing methodology for seismic data that takes seismic data directly to physical and mechanical models. The whole goal here is expedited CO2 plume movement and leak detection. And finally, the last one we touched on a little bit earlier, the synthetic geothermal reservoir, which is ultra long-term thermal energy storage using the subsurface for electricity and heat use. So if you have all these cool, fun ideas that you're thinking about, but you don't know where to start, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to jump on a call and talk about all of this stuff. With that, I want to say thank you. I have enjoyed giving this presentation. There is the Q&A session, and here's my email. I do feel like I'm rambling a little bit, mostly to give you an opportunity to write down my email. I've finished the presentation, so I am going to stop talking now and hopefully see you in the Q&A session. All right. Thanks, everyone. Stop recording.